afternoon, everyone. Let me start with a short introduction of myself. So my name is Bram Desmet, CEO of Solventure. For part of my time also linked to the Vlerick Business School, the author of 2 books, Supply Chain Strategy and Financial Metrics and the Strategy-Driven Supply Chain. I am working on a 3rd book. For that book, I've created a book council where we have been discussing a couple of concepts of where we are with supply chains today and how we should rethink and upgrade our supply chain capabilities. And basically I will share, we had 4 sessions with that book council. I will try to share a little bit what the ideas and thoughts are in that book council group. Before I dig into the topics, volatility, resilience, questions I see in many companies, I do want to take a brief start with our supply chain triangle question. How would we briefly describe it in 10 words? What is that supply chain triangle about? I have a couple of questions as a starter before I will be digging into content which might be new for some of you. Yeah, so indeed, balancing service cost and cash, service cost inventory. Here we go, cash cost service, yeah, good, fast, cheap, pick any 2. Yeah. I think that's the more strategic dimension. If I want to have premium service or premium products, maybe I'm a bit more service driven. I might have a somewhat higher cost. So our strategic positioning has an impact. And holistic decision making, I would say very true in the sense that in general, organizations are very functional. Yeah. I just had people from procurement here and they said, yeah, when R&D designs a new product, the primary KPI is cost, yeah, where it means that the whole supply chain is then organized from a cost perspective. Yeah. There is less attention for the inventory perspective, or there is less attention for, yeah, what's the flexibility we have from that supplier? Yeah? Are we able to scale up, which would help us from a service perspective, or scale down, which would help us from an inventory perspective? Are you familiar with how the supply chain triangle links to financial metrics? That's, I think, already a more difficult question. No is okay as an answer. That's also what we try to do in these type of webinars, is try to educate. So can you describe in 10 words how that triangle links to key financial metrics? Yeah, all affecting the return on capital employed, yeah, EBIT and ROCE. Yeah. We seem to have experts on the call today. Optimal use of capital, yeah, that's also a good way of saying it. Like, if I have working capital invested in the company, how do I best put it to use? If I look at my portfolio, if I have 10 million worth of inventory, yeah, is that invested in the right type of products, or how can I optimize by maybe reallocating and putting some stuff on make to order? Yeah. The quick scheme I wanted to show here is this one, which indeed you might know if you don't know it. So service is the driver for the sales or the top line. As an investor, it's not just about the top line or a top line metric like growth. I also want to see a margin. Well, the service or the sales minus the cost gives the margin. But in the end, it's about, okay, how can I optimize the margin I generate on the capital employed or the capital invested? Let me continue with some questions before I dig into some content. Have you been struggling with the supply chain triangle during COVID? It's potentially an open door, but it's important for us to understand and to remember. I would almost say let's never forget yeah, we have been struggling. I would say it depends a bit on the sector you were in. In the beginning of COVID, if you were producing food like pasta, retail sales was going through the roof. Pasta production was going through the roof. If you were supplying into automotive was shutting down. So we also saw a decrease in demand, but then in many sectors, the demand came back much faster than we expected. So everybody had a shortage of raw materials or key components. So that was what was going on. So let me even skip this question and go straight here and ask you, have you been struggling with the supply chain triangle over the last 6 months? Yeah. So I would say, yes, all of us have been struggling during COVID, but have we also struggled over the last 6 months? There seems to be a bit more nuance, like it's less obvious for all of us, but the general answer seems to be yes, we have been struggling with that supply chain triangle over the last 6 months. And can you give examples on what have been your key struggles over those last 6 months? So did we experience the same problems as during COVID, or over the last 6 months? Was it different? What have been our key struggles over the last 6 months? High inventory, missing critical parts. So I see that on some categories like microelectronics, there is still a shortage, but for most of the raw materials and components, the supply is no longer available. It's more like the demand is going down because everybody bought too much. So everybody's trying to reduce inventories. Yeah, we are like are we in a recession? Yes or no, but there seems to be more uncertainty. So that's also creating cautiousness in the orders. So demand in general is under pressure, uncertainty in demand. That's what we see here. Shortage in the labor force, capacity issues. So at least some of us still have more the capacity type of problem. Cost increase, yeah, for sure. Inflation, if your raw materials or components have some link to energy prices, we know that in Europe, energy prices went through the roof. That's also the inflation. Yeah, worry about funding streams versus recession. I see that across companies alike. Yeah, should we now invest in more flexibility and go to dual sourcing, or do we say no, hold on, we're going into a recession, so we're not going to increase the costs. Let's keep every euro in the pocket we can. Big backlog, so some companies still facing a big backlog. Uncertainty on the demand, shortage of raw materials. So in bullwhip, due to quick shifts in demand pricing, overstock. In general, across companies, my impression is that we have less of a supply issue or a raw material issue, but we more have a demand issue and a too much inventory issue. And I would say it makes the supply chain equally challenging. Like when the demand goes through the roof and we need to accelerate and all the suppliers need to follow, or when we need to push the brake and we need to slow down the full supply chain, including key suppliers. In general, it's equally challenging for supply chain managers, whether it's about accelerating or decelerating. And will it be back to normal, or should we prepare for continued volatility and disruptions? What do you think? Will it be back to normal, or should we prepare for continued volatility and disruptions? When I ask that question to executive teams, people in the US would tell me, hey, Bram, COVID is long gone. The market has stabilized here. European companies or European supply chain managers probably also had a much more direct impact from the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis. So there I see much more concern. And as I will try to explain, this question comes with the consequences. So if we say that the volatility is here to stay, for me, it means that we will need to upgrade our supply chain capabilities. So let me switch to that topic of volatility and resilience. As I mentioned at the start, I'm working on a third book, and I gathered a book council of relatively senior supply chain executives, typically of larger organizations, and I would say in general organizations which are not basic in supply chain, but at least have a lot of maturity, and typically in parts of the organization can be quite advanced. And I started from that question of volatility, and I asked them, has the volatility increased? The answer was yes. So most of the people there said yes, the volatility has increased. And Bram, you refer a lot to COVID, but it's much more than COVID. Then we had the Suez Canal, then we had the energy crisis. We had maybe shortage of raw materials, if I'm in food, because of the war in Ukraine. Yeah, so it's not just one event, but it's multiple events. The number of events has increased. Time between two events has become shorter. It also means there is less time or no time to recover. There is a compounding effect. So if transport is already a problem and then a ship parks in the Suez Canal, it's not 1 + 1 is 2, but it's 1 + 1 is 10. So the events are reinforcing each other in their effects. There's different drivers. I will come to it. Complexity is adding to the volatility. We'll also come back to it, and I will also try to show some examples where the feeling in that book council is like, the reference period 2010, 2020, that's not the reference period for the future. I gave them an empty fishbone and I said, okay, help me, volatility, what are the drivers for volatility? And there were different groups in that book council, and we tried to consolidate, and I came up with the following. What are drivers for volatility? On the one hand, it's what I called external factors. You see them here at the top. There are internal factors. That's what I show here at the bottom. And the external factors, I could quite easily link that to the typical strategic analysis, which is called PESTEL. So political, economic, societal, technological, environmental, legal, and we added ethical, PESTEL. And you can read for yourself, like what has been a source of volatility. Political, the war in Ukraine. I see a lot of fear in the eyes of any supply chain manager who has to do with microelectronics, because they say, what will happen if China invades Taiwan, knowing that half of the semiconductor industry is there, then the impact will be way bigger of what we have seen in COVID. So there's uncertainty and there's volatility. Economic factors, inflation, cost of capital, legal factors, the impact of Green Deal, Obamacare. It's been less the last 2 months, but I saw a lot of articles on the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on the import or export into the US, environmental effects like global warming. If this is more external, this is more internal. People tell me source of volatility. Bram, our customers started doing dual sourcing, like we are doing dual sourcing towards suppliers. Our customers are also doing dual sourcing, which makes it much harder to predict what the demand will be. So our response to volatility is basically creating volatility in return. For sure. We've globalized our supply chains, and those more global supply chains meant that we were much more prone to transport problems. We had huge issues with availability of transport, cost of transport, and even locally cost of drivers. So that has been causing volatility. And so I consider these to be more internal because this is stuff which we much better control compared to the external drivers which are there on top. And then I told myself, yeah, for a long time already as Solventure, we have invested in capabilities around leading indicators. So I talked to one of our experts, Gillian, and I said, hey, Gillian, can we measure this? Can we measure this volatility? Because as supply chain people, we feel it on a daily basis, but if we can measure it, we can also show it to the non-supply chain experts. And maybe that will help them to understand that if the volatility has increased, that we also need to create a more responsive supply chain in return. And he said, yeah, Bram, if you look at the impact of political tensions, we could look at the import-export volatility. For instance, for the US, if you look at economic drivers, inflation, we can look at the changes in the consumer price index. We have data on interest rates. And just to pick another one here on environmental drivers, we all understand global warming. But what is the impact? Maybe we can try to see whether we have data on what is the number of hurricanes or floods, for instance, in the south of the US, because those hurricanes or floods are disturbing port activity, and that again creates volatility for our supply chain. And if I quickly run through that, so this is the inflation, the percent change in the consumer price index. We also included the links where you can find the data, and the slides will be distributed later on. And okay, this is over a longer period of time. And also for myself, when looking at that data, I indeed say, if I look at the reference period 2010 to 2020, what we have seen over the last few years is completely different. It's not that we didn't have inflation before 2020, but you see that, okay, it was more controlled. It was within a more narrow bandwidth. If you look at what happened here, so the peak is much higher. So the height of the inflation was much higher than what we had since a long time, and also the acceleration is much stronger. If you see how fast the inflation went up and how fast the inflation was going down, it probably needs different capabilities in our supply chain. For instance, understanding the impact of cost prices and how are we going to translate that cost towards our customers. Second example, the cost of capital. So interest rates. Here we see that for a lot of the 2010-2020 period, cash was basically for free. It also means that inventory was basically for free. It's not that we did not increase interest rates. You see that the interest rates went up, but it went relatively slow. Then in response to COVID again, central banks lowered interest rates, but same story here. So the level of the interest rates is much higher than what it used to be the last 10 years. And also the pace at which those interest rates increased, it went up much faster. Import-export balances. So this is the net export of goods and services for the US. So what we see here in 2010-2020, that the US has been a net importer. There is some variability, but okay, it's variability around a certain level. If we see again what happened here since 2020, we see that there are abrupt changes. So all of a sudden we go to levels that we have never seen before. You see how fast it's going down. You see how fast it's going up again. So these are all signals that indeed the last years have been more volatile than the 10 years before. And last example here, major hurricanes in the North Atlantic. And here I zoom out a little bit and take a longer perspective. So if you look at the number of major hurricanes in the 70s, 80s, and you compare that since the 90s and the nillies, yeah, it's obvious to see that not just the average number of major hurricanes went up, you also see that the peaks are much higher. And these days, I would almost say the question is not, will there be a major hurricane? The question is more, how many will there be and when will they hit us? Yeah? Or which ports are going to be disturbed, and how is this going to influence our supply chain operation? And again, to that book council, I then asked, I said, okay, what is the impact? Well, first of all, again, in that group, and I'm also using that group to validate my own thoughts, that it's not just Bram who thinks something, but the conclusions are validated by a broader group of senior supply chain professionals, yeah, from I would say professional companies. And yeah, that group confirms and says, hey, we lack flexibility and agility. Yeah? We lack resilience. Everybody today talks about resilience. And everybody would agree with the statement that, yeah, that the supply chains that we have built, and typically we have built them pre-corona. So we have built them in that period 2010 to 2020. The supply chains we have built in that period, well, for sure, they have not been able to deal with the volatility in the COVID period, but we see that the volatility is still there. So those supply chains are not future-proof. And I again gave them an empty fishbone, and I said, okay, help me to understand what is then the impact. Yeah? The fact that the volatility is over here, yeah? and the flexibility of our supply chain is over here. How does that hurt? And let me jump to that fishbone. Again, different groups came up with different results, and we tried to compile in this way. It was actually not that difficult to link it to the 5 Ps, which are used in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so prosperity, people, planet, peace, partnership. And if we look at the impact of not being agile enough, for sure it hits the supply chain triangle. So it impacts the service. You can look over here. It impacts the cost, because we need to do expediting or spot buys. We have reduced OEE. It impacts our cash, because now we have a lot of excess inventory. We potentially need to do write-offs. And yeah, those service cost cash are obviously impacting top line margin and cash flow. And so we may have missed launches. We are too late in the market. We might have price erosion. Yeah, at least the predictability of the cash flow is poor. And if the predictability of cash flow is poor, it might lead to cuts in CapEx, or it might even lead to dividend cuts. And so there's a lot of impact on the financial side, or in SDG terms, I would say that's the prosperity angle. Yeah? But there's obviously also a lot of impact on the people side. So stress, burnout, turnover in the organization. Yeah? So yeah, I would say we've been burning people over the last few months and years by the lack of having adequate supply chain design and adequate supply chain planning process. We've been way too reactive, and that has had a huge impact on the people factor in the supply chain. It also had planet impact. So we've been flying stuff around the world which really don't belong on an airplane. We've also been less efficient in production, so increased waste, inefficient resource consumption. It has also impacted the partnership. So yeah, lack of trust between suppliers and customers, or a lack of trust between our customers and us. So yeah, it's been bad from a partnership or a trust perspective. And yeah, we potentially even unlocked extra regulation if we are in heavily regulated sectors, because we were not able to supply or deliver. And potentially there was extra regulation which is forcing us into certain solutions which maybe are not optimal for the long term. It can even have an impact on the peace dimension, because you almost feel the anxiety in organizations or in the economy. And I added competitive positioning because, yeah, it can lead to loss of market share, reputation. It could even impact our credit rating. So, yeah, if the responsiveness of our supply chain or the resilience is not in line with the volatility around us, this is the impact it can have. And it's not looking nice, I would say. So that's why I often ask the question, is the volatility here to stay? Because if the volatility remains over here and the capability remains over here, this will remain the continued consequence. And I'm not sure that any of you is looking forward to that. And then I again asked the group, another fishbone. I said, okay, how can we build more resilience? And let me just jump to that fishbone again. How can we build more resilience? Remember that we said, okay, the volatility comes on the one hand from the external factors, the pestle factors. Yeah. The volatility also comes from our own supply chain design. Yeah, the fact that we started sourcing far away has made us more vulnerable. And if then we have transport problems or transport prices increase, yeah, then if that container all of a sudden is 10 times as expensive, yeah, that's part of the volatility we are exposed to. But if we are looking for resilience, we also split it in those two dimensions, I would say. When it comes to those external drivers and to those external factors, what the group came up with is that they said, okay, we need to have better sensing capabilities. Like, nobody really knows where the demand is going. And for sure, we should not just rely on what's the sales history and extrapolate the sales history. Yeah, we should try to better understand what are market drivers and see where the market drivers are going. Yeah? So macroeconomic indicators and leading indicators, yeah, is probably much more key today than it was 5 years ago when markets were relatively stable. If we don't have that insight today, yeah, it probably becomes impossible to understand where the market is going. Yeah. Not just external data, but also internal. Yeah. Having visibility on our own chain, first-tier suppliers, but potentially even second-tier or third-tier suppliers. And also channel data, like, hey, what's the inventory sitting on our side? What's the inventory sitting on the customer side? If we don't understand inventory positions, again, it might become very hard to understand the forecast and the demand signal. Then I would say, yeah, better understanding risks, how we can deal with risks, scenario management capabilities. Emergency response also came up. So people said, yeah, we should prepare for a next disruption. We don't necessarily know whether it comes from the customer side, whether it comes from the supplier side, or whether it will come from the left or from the right, but we should think through how we can deploy emergency response teams, which can make fast decisions, which can make easy escalations high in the organization, so that we can react quickly when something hits us. So let's think about that. And yeah, maybe also do stakeholder management, like if government could have an influence, if pressure groups could have an influence, can we connect to them up front to understand where their thoughts are going, so that we are not taken by surprise, but yeah, we try to be informed. So I would say there's a lot of things here, yeah, which have to do with how are we more connected, how are we more aware, visibility, sensing, scenario, emergency response. Yeah, so that's dealing with the external world. And then when it's about the internal world, yeah, we probably need to rethink our supply chains and say, is it still wise to source a lot from Asia? Should we go to nearshoring? Should I go to multi-sourcing? Also, when I look at my transport exposure, maybe nearshoring would also help, because if it's locally within a region, maybe there's more fallbacks or there's more options. Yeah? Also, when we design our manufacturing plants, yeah, maybe we should try to create more asset flexibility, instead of having focused factories and having one SKU being able to be produced in only one plant. Maybe it would make more sense to say, no, let's make sure that that same SKU can be made in multiple plants. Also here, should our production be global or should it be regional for regional? So there's a lot of supply chain design questions, and yeah, not just designing for minimum cost or maximum efficiency, but also designing for flexibility and speed. And then as I went through that with that book council, and also as it was settling in more in my mind, I would also say I increasingly see a lot of value in simplification. Yeah? Also in that book council, we started to realize that complexity drives volatility. Why is that? If things are more complex, more things can go wrong. So complexity automatically is a driver for volatility. It also means that if we want to become more resilient, we really need to think about how can we simplify it, because simplification will also lead to robustness. And I'll try to give a couple of examples. Like if I look at portfolios, how complex the portfolio of some organizations is, like, is that really the best possible situation for a company to be in? Yeah? Can we be very resilient if we have very complex portfolios? Or if I look at our service promises, I see companies who have 60,000 SKUs, and they promise different lead times to different customers on a portfolio of 60,000 SKUs, different lead times to different customers on a portfolio of 60,000 SKUs. It's impossible to manage. So, yeah, many of us have an engineering mindset. We make things so complex that it almost becomes impossible to manage it in an efficient way. Another example from the portfolio or the service design, that we do make to stock, we do make to order. What is the make to order lead time? The make to order lead time is 2 weeks. So make to stock is of course available on stock. Make to order lead time is 2 weeks. What's the production lead time? The production lead time is 4 weeks. I said, okay, I don't really understand, because if the production lead time is 4 weeks, 2 weeks lead time to the customer doesn't really help. So it's either 0 or it's either 4 weeks. The service promise is often designed by the sales organization, but the sales organization has no insight in what is needed or meaningful from a supply chain perspective. So we do a lot of crazy stuff, for instance, on that selling side in portfolios, in service design. We make things way too complex, and in general, it's certainly not designed for robustness. So also here, thinking that through, I would say is important. And also, if I look at manufacturing flows, I see, I would say quite often supply chain flows are designed from a minimum cost perspective. But if I see some products traveling around the world before they finally land at the final customer, here again, from a resilience or flexibility or robustness perspective, have we done the right things here? So we can try to capture how to design for flexibility and speed, but sometimes I would say we also just need a bit more common sense, because without figuring out all the detailed numbers, sometimes by looking at certain flows, you feel that it can never be robust and it will never be resilient. So next to a lot of more details and financial details, I would also plead for sometimes having a bit more common sense. If you feel that it's not going to work, then don't do it, right? Let's stop fooling ourselves. Yeah? And so on the top here, I linked that to what Gartner launched last year as sense, shift, and steer. So they called that an offset strategy. So you need to have better sensing capabilities. When we see that something is going on, and we need to be able to make shifts. And once we're in a new situation, how do we steer from there? So I think that's creating resilience. And when it's about the supply chain design, the portfolio design, planning processes, so simplification and designing for robustness, flexibility, and speed. Again, that's what came out of that book council. And sensing, we can help there. I would say from a leading indicator forecasting perspective, the indicators I showed were more generic. We can also zoom into your specific supply chain. And this is a case we did with Solvay. It has been well put out there. There's also a webinar on that, so we have a recording. So if you're buried somewhere deeper in the supply chain, yeah, we can map the supply chain with you and create visibility. So yes, in the end, you are delivering to automotive. There's data on vehicle seals, but there's also data on vehicle assemblies, but there's also data on industrial production of motor vehicle parts. And there's also data available on inventories on that chain. So if you want to understand where the demand is going, you try to map your supply chain and try to get indicators on that supply chain. And we can also help with for sure with the planning piece. And if I try to quickly go there, because I see we are getting close to the time. So let me ask you again here on Mentimeter, what is your current level of Gartner S&OP maturity, and what do you think your target level should be? On a maturity level, I would say many companies I see are 1 to 2. And the typical ambition I see is to go to 3 to 4, and that's what's typically in our mind. Yeah? And so here I mapped the different maturity stages also to the triangle. So stage 1 means we are disconnected. I see companies where production is not taking into account inventory targets, but more working based on their own plans. I see companies where procurement is not ordering based on some kind of MRP result, but is ordering based on their own forecast, maybe based on historical raw material consumption and some kind of reorder point. So there are companies where there are really disconnects. Stage 2 for me means that we connect the different corners, but we do it from a volume perspective. Stage 3 for me means that, yeah, on the supply and the inventory, yeah, we also know the cost information. So we cannot just balance in volumes, but we can also see the cost impact and can make scenarios based on cost. Stage 4 for me would mean that we also know the sales price, so we can optimize based on margin. And stage 5 means, okay, we cannot just make decisions based on margin, but we are also connected to key customers and key suppliers. And this comes from a Gartner report from 2022, so that's quite recent. And this is what Gartner still promotes, that maybe we are at level 2 and we should go to level 3, or we should go to level 4. But I strongly believe in the current volatile markets that we all need to go to level 5. Tell me how you are going to plan your supply chain if you're not connected to key customers and key suppliers. Yeah? Knowing that the supplier could be the problem, yeah? Or the demand signal of the customer could be uncertain. So we need to be connected, yeah? And tell me, in these uncertain market circumstances, how we will make good decisions if we cannot monetize our decisions. So I believe we all need to go to level 5, and also say that in other circumstances that Gartner is not really helpful by having level 1 to 5. I propose that we extend the maturity up to level 10, because we will only feel like it makes sense to go to level 5 if we know that in the end we need to get to level 10. So also here, yeah, improving our planning capabilities and making sure, I think a lot of companies still struggle to be internally connected on that triangle, and make sure that we have good information from sales and that we can translate that to key suppliers. A lot of companies still have separate and disconnected financial planning processes, so we for sure don't have the full financial information or transparency in the S&OP. Well, also here, for sure as Solventure we can help. And then to close the webinar here today, so the supply chains we have built pre-COVID are incapable to deal with the current and future volatility. It impacts key financial parameters and at least puts relationships under pressure, relationship with customers, with suppliers, and with our workforce. As part of becoming more resilient, we need to increase the awareness in the executive team. We can help there. We give quite some training. We have an education service. So some of the stuff I've shown here, we can also bring that to your executive team. For sure, we need to build better sensing capabilities. I've shown some generic information, but we can also map that to your supply chain. So if you want to know more, please reach out to us. And for sure, everything I said today creates the context where it should be obvious that we should upgrade our planning capabilities. And that's a core capability of Solventure. So that's also certainly something where we can help. And the time to act is now. If we don't want to be confronted with all the negative impacts which we've shown in one of those fish bones, again, the time to act is now. We shouldn't wait. We should do it now. If you put in questions in the Q&A box, you can also vote for your questions. How does data sharing policy need to evolve to support moving to level 5? We always share data between customers and us, or between us and suppliers. And the type of information we share is order information. And we will need to share much more than just order information. If I look at the customer side, so instead of just receiving orders, I think it's key to have visibility on inventories, inventory consumption, historical consumption, and like future plans. And so having a better understanding of where the requirements of your customers are coming from, I think that's key. And I would say with customers, and that could be an MPS type of visibility, also try to have longer term visibility, like, okay, what type of capacities do we need to reserve for key customers? What type of key raw materials or key components should we already buy, certainly if it's customer specific? And can we agree with key customers on what commitments they are willing to take towards capacities or to certain key components or requirements? And the same holds true towards our key suppliers. Instead of just sharing order information, can we share a rolling MPS plan or a requirements plan? And can we also have a collaborative S&OP where we say, okay, dear supplier, this is the type of capacity I want you to reserve for me the next coming months. And if you need to commit to certain customer specific key raw materials or components, I'm willing to commit yes or no. So lifting the collaboration from a transactional up to the more tactical level, that's an example of how data sharing needs to evolve. Thoughts on moving more towards material being made to order versus made to stock? Well, there's two options. I would say either you improve the demand signal and if the demand signal cannot be improved, then you will try to increase the lead time, because if the demand signal is very uncertain and very inaccurate, then just producing inventory which is sitting there is creating waste in the supply chain. And I would say make to order is maybe a more defensive behavior. It might also be negatively perceived from a customer because it will be increasing his lead time. In general, if it's a key customer, let's try to connect with that customer and let's try to make a forecast together. And instead of measuring the on time in full, like when he places an order, was I able to immediately deliver? What becomes more important is the stock availability at the customer's side. So let's also try to measure at the next point in the chain through a VMI kind of arrangement. So I would say that's probably the competing models. And if you're in a collaboration mindset, then I would more go for that VMI. Practically possible to jump from level 2 to level 5, or do we need to upscale in steps? Good question. I would say for sure, first try to align internally before you try to connect externally. I see companies who say, we receive a forecast from the customer. Yeah, but if you don't have a good demand planning, or a demand planning which is not coupled to a rough cut planning or a master planning, if you can't use the information, then it will only leave the customer or sales frustrated. So I do think that you need to build internal capabilities before you can truly connect to key customers or key suppliers. But the reason I'm drumming that beat on the level 5 is because I would like you to talk to your management and say, hey, it's not just about going to level 2 or 3 or 4. No, we should really mentally prepare to go to level 5. So we will need to speed up the level of investment. And most probably you will also need to do a lot of education on that top level in the organization, because people at the top of the organization, they still think that the supply chain fixed it during COVID. So I think the attitude there still is like, but supply chain will fix it again. And as supply chain, we should say, no, supply chain is going to stop fixing it, because we always fix it in ways that there is value loss, extra costs, or the wrong inventory. And it's time that as organizations, also instead of being reactive, we become more proactive, and that we bring structural solutions instead of ad hoc problem fixing. So I'm telling about the level 5 because basically I hope that's the message you will bring to your management. And when they start thinking level 5, the investment for level 3 and level 4 will come much more quickly. And I do believe it's needed before we can further step up. How do you feel AI will take part on supply chains and help balance the triangle? I would say, for me, AI is an advanced analytic technique. And before AI, we already had statistical forecasting, or we had optimization techniques. And we have a massive amount of data. Portfolios are complex, product portfolios, customer portfolios. So we need these type of techniques to be able to handle the complexity in today's supply chains. And do these techniques help? Do they add value? The answer is yes. And will AI shift the capabilities and the baseline? The answer is also yes. But let's keep our feet on the ground, because I see a lot of companies who struggle with very basic data like master data or transactional data. Well, as long as we don't fix our basic data problems, I'm also sure that AI will only produce rubbish from rubbish. So yes, AI holds a lot of promises, but it doesn't solve some of the basic problems we have today: data accuracy, data quality, executive buy-in, and awareness in the non-supply chain community. So AI is not going to solve that for us. And I'll really have to start closing down. It's good that the questions keep coming. And if we did not answer all the questions, we may individually reach out to you to then still come back at a later stage. But you didn't mention circularity yet. Will it have an impact? Yes, and we could do a completely separate webinar on that. But I think companies in the sustainability domain will need to make a strategic choice, like, do I want to play at par, meaning in the sense that I'm not necessarily doing much more, or I'm not doing necessarily better than others, but I'm also not lagging behind, or do I want to differentiate, or do I want to dominate? And the strategic choice you made on the sustainability axis, just as an example, will define how deep you go in the circularity. And yeah, the further you want to go in the circularity, also the more impact it has on your supply chain design. If you take a Dutch company like Interfaces, where the whole production process is based on recycled yarns, which they draw from oceans, it's not necessarily the cheapest supply chain, but it's certainly one of the more sustainable and circular supply chains. So again, then the whole supply chain in the end could be designed with that target sustainability in mind. Yeah. And I think we can maybe refer also in a follow-up post or follow-up email on some of the recent stuff we've been investigating and making public there on how to link that sustainability into the supply chain design. But it's certainly an increasingly important aspect to take into account. So thank you for joining, and hope to see you back at the next occasion.